Hi guys, Taven or Vil here, and today we are going to be talking about why Final Fantasy X is the greatest video game of all time. No, that title is not clickbait. I 100% believe that Final Fantasy X is the greatest game of all time. We're going to be talking about why, we're going to be talking about the details, we're going to be talking about everything you want to know about Final Fantasy X in this video today. So sit back, grab some popcorn, get a drink of water, and let's dive right in. Before we get started, I do want to say that this video is subjective. It's just my opinion. Yours may be different, and that's okay. We can have different opinions. Just sound off down in the comments below if you've got a different opinion. Let me know what you think of the video, and let's get right into it. This video will contain spoilers for Final Fantasy X, and this does include all versions of the game, the original PS2, the International, the HD Remaster, and any other version on any other console that you can think of. It's going to contain spoilers. It's pretty much the same game across the board. The only real changes are a couple of text errors and stuff like that. So this does cover all versions of the game, and I just wanted to get that out of the way. All right, finally getting to the meat of the video. Final Fantasy X is the greatest game of all time. I say that with my whole heart, my whole brain, my whole soul. And I fully believe that. I fully believe that Final Fantasy X may never be surpassed. There could be a game in the future. Elden Ring has come close for me. But I do believe, as of right now, Final Fantasy X is the greatest game to have ever come out of the game industry. The reasoning why is a little bit spread out. So, first of all, I want to talk a little bit anecdotally. Is that a word, anecdotally? I want to talk with an anecdote. When I was a kid, I got in a lot of trouble. And one of the reasons I kind of love Final Fantasy X is because my dad gave me a choice once when I got in trouble and was grounded. And he basically said, you can keep your PS2, but you can only keep one game. And the rest are going to be like locked up for an indeterminate amount of time. And I was leaning towards a few games, but my mom told me, go with Final Fantasy X because it's what you're having the most fun with. And I picked Final Fantasy X, and I put hundreds of hours into the PS2 version of that game. I still have the save files on my PS2. And that game honestly changed my life. I don't think I would be the same person I am without Final Fantasy X. And not only does Final Fantasy X hold a special place in my heart because of that, but it holds a place in my heart because, honestly, everything coming together in that game just add up to one of the most satisfying experiences in the world. Not only do you have the religious undertones, you have the entire, overarching story of the pilgrimage, you also have the fish out of water story with Titus. Yes, it's Titus, it's not Titus. I hate Titus, I hate that name. I don't care if it's canon. Titus is canon to me, and I am the biggest Final Fantasy X fan. I'll fight anybody on that. Not to mention just the entire twists and turns that the story goes on. The entire thing adds up to create an experience that is more fun and more satisfying than anything in the world. Any other game, any other experience. Final Fantasy X makes me go back to that summer when I was grounded because I had gotten in trouble at school or something. I don't even remember what it was. It was so inconsequential in the grand scheme of things that when I go back and look at that, the only thing that stands out to me is that I chose Final Fantasy X, and I'm glad I did. If I hadn't, everything would probably be different. If I'd chosen another game, maybe I wouldn't even be into games anymore. Maybe I wouldn't be here. God, maybe I wouldn't be here. I know, obviously, there's going to be a day on Earth when I'm not here, but till then, I'm here. I'm queer. Get used to it. I want to talk a little bit more objectively and talk about what actually makes up the game. The story features Titus, a young blitzball player from the city of Xanarkand, who ends up sort of traveling to another world known as Spira, where he is the fish out of water, so to speak. He is unaware of the customs and the way of the world, as it were, the lay of the land, and he is led through by Waka and Lulu and Yuna, who are obviously citizens of this world, who are on a pilgrimage. The pilgrimage is a sort of religious travel that consists of visiting various temples under the faith of Yevon, a overarching religion, sort of like, well, I don't want to make comparisons to the real world, but there are a lot of countries that tend to be led through religion rather than political power or legislation. It's more so what the religion desires and what the people of the religion think is best for the people of the country. So in this case, what the people of the religion desire is to send young summoners, as they're known, which Yuna is one of, young summoners in order to gain the ultimate power to defeat the evil sea monster Sin. They send them on this pilgrimage to gain knowledge and power, and ultimately use that power to defeat Sin. But in the process, it's found out that actually the summoner dies along the pilgrimage. It always happens without fail, and it always comes back. Sin always comes back. It's a cycle. And the people of Yevon are happy to be in this cycle because of the temporary respite that is brought to them by the calm, which is the time before Sin returns. And so when Sin returns, the world is back to chaos. It's back to being afraid to build cities too large for fear of Sin destroying it. And they think that if they repent for their sins, which the sins being using machina, which are machines, by repenting and not using those machines, perhaps Sin will go away and no longer destroy their towns or harm them. Another thing is that the people of the world are made up of fireflies. When they die, they turn into fireflies. And if they don't, they usually turn into fiends. And if they have unfinished business that is strong enough, they have a strong enough desire to continue on, then even in death, they will persist as sort of ghouls, in a way. A zombie, so to speak. And they will continue about their business with all of the memories and everything and be able to create new memories and new experiences for themselves and their souls. Which the souls are separate from the fireflies, but that's a whole other weird conundrum that I don't entirely understand despite being the biggest Final Fantasy X fan. So in this, we go on this pilgrimage and we meet up with a couple of other people such as Auron, who is actually seemingly from Zanarkand, but is actually originally from Spira, and traveled to Zanarkand in order to get Titus and take him to Spira. We also have Riku, who is one of the Albed, which is a separate entity from the Yevonites. They do not follow the Yevon religion. They believe that machina are okay, and that Sin can be killed through other means than sending summoners to their deaths. Yuna is a young summoner whose father was the last High Summoner. The High Summoner is the title bestowed upon a summoner who defeats Sin and is killed in the process. And Yuna is hoping to become the next High Summoner and be led to her death, which she knows about the whole time, and nobody ever tells Titus until about halfway, maybe 2/3 through the game. As you go on this journey, it is fairly linear compared to many of the other previous games. However, I will say that Final Fantasy has always sort of been a linear series. Considering the levels and the different ways that you can explore things, most of the games actually don't open up to become open world until at least halfway or 2/3 of the way through the game, which this game also does. One criticism levied against this game is that it is a hallway simulator similar to Final Fantasy XIII, but really it features just about the same amount of freedom, and it just doesn't show you a world map like the other games do. So it tends to look like it's linear or more linear than the other games, but really it's really just as linear as the other ones. They just give you the illusion of choice by limiting you to a single part of the world map and letting you see the whole map, but really they're all linear. They're all linear except maybe, just maybe, Final Fantasy 15. But even then, there's like 2 towns in the entire world. 3, sorry, I almost forgot about Altissia. But really, it all boils down to this game is linear, suck it up. Now, the illusion of linearity is one that I am perfectly willing to fall under because the exploration afforded in the end of the game is more fun than anything else offered in the end games of the other games. So when I talk about endgame, I'm talking about you're at a stage where you can defeat the final boss, but there are other quests to do. There are other things such as celestial weapons, such as mini games that you have the choice in whether or not you want to do instead of being forced to do them like Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. Haha. And along with that, there are monsters to capture, which actually is amazing because it's one of the few mini games I've ever seen that allows you to go through and revisit areas you've already visited, maybe with a whole new lens and maybe a new appreciation for the amount of creatures provided. Like, you go to the starting island and you're like, oh man, there's only 3 creatures here to capture. And then you go to the next island, there's like 6 or 7, I think. And you can just go through and capture them. You have to capture 10 of each, which may be a bit excessive. If there were to remake this game, I would say maybe 5, maybe less, maybe only 1. But all that being said, I think all of the side quests in this game just add up more to make this the greatest game of all time. Along with that, throughout the game, there are side quests you can do, such as you can start the creature collecting a little bit early. You can start that maybe halfway through the game. It might be a little past halfway, depending on how you count things. You also can do the Cloister of Trials, which is part of the pilgrimage where you visit temples. And you can do little side quests in there with something called the Destruction Sphere, where you have to solve a secondary puzzle within the puzzle itself that allows you to get an extra item and also allows you to get some endgame content later on. Along with that, there are the Dark Aeons added in the international and the remastered versions of the game, which you may stumble upon in a regular playthrough on accident, and they are very, very difficult. They are extremely hard fights that require a lot more luck, a lot more, I don't mean luck literally, I mean luck skill. They also require very high stats, they require you to think critically, and this ties into what I want to talk about next, which is one of the best battle systems of all time, the conditional time-based battle system. Is that what it's called? Hold on, the CTB system. What does CTB stand for? Now, the conditional turn-based battle system is very simple. You can see upcoming turns, and your turns are determined by a combination of speed and moves. So if your character's natural speed is a little bit faster, they will get more turns, and they will get turns before the enemy, but if the enemy's speed is higher, then they will get more turns. And so it is a bit of a balancing act between making sure your speed is high enough and also using the right moves to make sure you get more moves. So some moves have higher priority, something that is very known to like Pokemon fans. There are like high priority moves. There are moves that always hit first. Sometimes those moves intersect when like 2 different people use a move like Fake Out at the same time. That's a priority move, and whoever speed wins in that situation will win the Fake Out battle. It's very, very easy to learn and very easy to pick up because it's very simple. It's one person's turn, then it's another person's turn, and time has nothing to do with it. You can take as long as you need to think about what your next move is going to be. It's sort of like chess if you play regular chess and not the super time-based, gotta hit the timer to sink in your move type chess, some Bobby Fischer type chess. You don't need to be doing anything like that. You can take as long as you need to do what you need to do. Which ties into the next point I want to make. The sphere grid is one of the best progression systems in any game. So if you're unfamiliar, the sphere grid is basically a giant grid of, well, spheres that all represent different abilities, different stats, and different ways to progress. So these are the way that you develop your characters. You go through the sphere grid and you use spheres that you get from defeating enemies or buying them later on in the game. And you can use these to actually like do a bunch of different things. Like you can learn new abilities, you can learn new magic, you can learn new skills, and you can increase your stats. Now there are also spheres that will allow you to change the sphere grid. So somebody else's sphere grid might not look the exact same as yours, but there are spheres that allow you to clear what the current node is, and there are also empty nodes on the sphere grid that allow you to go and add new stats to them. So you can get stat spheres from defeating certain enemies, and you can use those in order to change the sphere grid and amplify whatever stat you would like to do. So the sphere grid is a very nice system. Everybody has a shared sphere grid, but each character has their own development along that sphere grid. So stats are not shared between characters, but in the end, your characters will end up being an amalgamation of each other, except some characters just have naturally higher stats starting out at the beginning of the game. For example, Riku has just higher speed than the other characters. Titus has naturally a little bit more accuracy than other characters, but less than Waka. Waka has the most accuracy. By the end of the game, it's all going to be combined. They're all going to have maxed out stats if you play through endgame content. Now, the other endgame content is also defeating the creatures from the monster arena, the man-made characters by the creature collector himself, and these creatures are very difficult. They're something you would almost consider like endgame dungeons in another game, like Final Fantasy XIV, for example, or something that you would consider like an endgame boss in something like Borderlands, like a raid boss almost, or a Terra raid battle in Pokemon. I'm just trying to pull a couple of examples, but they're endgame content. They're meant to be done with very high-leveled characters, and they're meant to be done with great carefulness, with a lot of planning and a lot of understanding strategy and a lot of planning beforehand and understanding exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Defeating all these creatures nets you a lot of experience that you use for the sphere grid. So some people will farm certain characters like the Don Tonberry and certain creatures, and they will use those spheres to move forward in the sphere grid and develop further, because there are the Dark Aeons to take on, but there also is a final super boss, and it is very, very, very difficult. Penance is one of the toughest fights in all of Final Fantasy, and I think one of the best examples of an endgame boss. Because it is tough, it requires precise planning, it requires a lot of preparation beforehand, and it is very hard to cheese outside of using Zanmato, which is a very, very overpowered ability and something I'm not going to get into today, but gosh, it is easy to cheese in this game if you so wish. I just appreciate when people don't. Not saying anybody's invalid for using the Zanmato cheese, but there you go. I definitely think Final Fantasy X has a lot of character as well. Not only characters, but also character. I think the game has its own flavor, its own blend. And a lot of that comes from the main character, Titus, who a lot of people find to be tedious, a little bit overwhelming at times, where he is just very boisterous and loud, especially like the laughing scene from Luca, the megaphone scene from Luca, where he's telling the Luca goers that they're going to lose this year and the Besaid Aurochs are going all the way to the championship, and Blitzball, which is a whole nother can of worms. But I think that lends to the game perfectly. Titus is a young, like I said, boisterous young man who is just full of character. He's full of energy. He's full of love. He's full of there's trauma there from Jecht. There's trauma there from losing his father, who is just a whole different beast. Man, he is a jerk. He is bad, and he finds his redemption through these spheres that you find throughout the game, called Jecht spheres, but also there is Auron sphere and I think Braska sphere, where you learn a little bit more about Jecht in Spira. Now, Jecht disappeared from Zanarkand 10 years before the start of the game, and 10 years before the start of the game, he showed up in Spira. So this is one and the same Jecht. He went on a pilgrimage with Braska, who is Yuna's father, the aforementioned High Summoner, and Auron, one of our party members, but a little bit younger without the sunglasses. And they went on this pilgrimage, and throughout, Jecht learned to stop drinking, he learned the ways of Spira, and he really learned that he misses his family, he wants to see them again. And he knows that maybe there's no way for him to go back to Zanarkand, but at the very least, he can make the world a better place. And so that's what he tries to do. He goes on the pilgrimage with Braska, and in the end, he becomes Sin, and he kills Braska, because that's what he has to do. That's what has to happen. The final summoning always kills its summoner. And so Jecht becomes Sin, which is told to Titus by Auron, and kept from Yuna for most of the game in order to make sure that she continues on her pilgrimage and doesn't slightly falter at this. So as the game continues, as the game progresses, you learn more and more about Spira, you learn more and more about Zanarkand in a way, and you learn more about our characters. Waka is racist, and that's pretty much it for about half the game. He also has his own trauma with losing his brother, losing his parents, and losing a lot of blitzball over the years, which is the one thing he thought he could count on. There's also Lulu, who has her own trauma, her own form of living and understanding the world, which is typically through a cynical lens, mostly because she has lost people close to her. She is basically like the best friend and companion of Waka throughout the entire game, and actually in the sequel they end up married and having a child together, but that's a whole nother game for another video. One thing that I really like about these characters is all of them are so developed. A lot of people talk about how everyone understands and knows the characters from Final Fantasy VII, especially in the Rebirth remake continuity, but Final Fantasy X I think features just as good, if not honestly, in some cases better characters. The understanding of them is a little bit deeper to me, and maybe it's because of the voice acting, which I think Remake and Rebirth do an amazing job with, but also I think the story in those games tends to lend itself to being a bit more confusing. I obviously understand it, but I don't wish I understood it. Sometimes I wish I was just blissfully ignorant of Final Fantasy VII's story and the pure amount of things in it, because Final Fantasy X is better to me, and Final Fantasy X is just so fun, and the combat is so satisfying, the progression feels worthwhile, the endgame content really ties it all together, making that progression feel more worthwhile, making the entire story kind of come together, especially when you get to the final boss, you get to the end of the game, and you're faced with fighting Braska's final summon inside of Sin, and you fight what is essentially Jacked as a summon, and he is so powerful, and some people have killed him in 2 hits, and that's insane. And I think what's really fun about this game is just seeing these characters grow, seeing these characters live. Maybe you don't see them in their day-to-day life, you're seeing them in a bit of an extreme circumstance, but one of the things that ties it all together is just seeing the humanness of it all, even in the characters that are a bit less human. One of the things that I touched on earlier was the religious undertones, but what I should have said was religious overtones, as the religion is pretty prominent throughout this game. There's definitely a story to be told here about Yevon and about the corruption that runs all the way up to the top of Yevon, and the religious analysis is best saved for another day in my eyes, because this video is going to be long enough talking about the best game of all time. I don't want to talk about the religion and drag it down. The one thing I will say is that there is a lot to be said about the stance that the developers of the game took on religion and the organized format of it, and more so the way that people can be overcome with power and the way people can abuse that power in the name of continuing what they believe to be best, even in the face of an alternate route. Now, I don't want to get too political or too religious or too preachy, but I think the religious overtones in this game are very well done, and I think there is a lot to be said about their choice to feature this so prominently throughout the game. And it doesn't take away from the experience at all. It actually adds quite a bit to it. It adds a lot of flavor. It adds a lot of character. There are more characters such as Maester Seymour, Maester Micah, Maester Keenock, even, some of the minor religious characters like Shalinda, the Chocobo Knights. I wouldn't tie them so much up with the religion, but they are prominent characters you see throughout the game. And the contrast with the Al Bhed's way of doing things, and the way the Al Bhed look at things at face value, rather than trying to take some kind of big some big cycle-based view on things like the spiral of death that they talk about in, like Maester Seymour talks about later on in the game. The Al Bhed tend to take more of a optimistic approach to things. One day we'll defeat sin type thing. One day the world will be free from sin. And I think there's a couple people probably in the Al Bhed who are like, one day we'll be free of Yevon. Now, one thing commonly misunderstood about this game is that Al Bhed is not technically a language. Al Bhed is a cipher. So when you pick up an Al Bhed primer, you're actually figuring out that one letter represents another letter. That is why the language sounds a little bit funky, but it just uses the 26 Roman are they Roman? The regular alphabet that we use in English every single day. Now, this really isn't much of an important point, but it is a distinction that I like to talk about because I think it's funny that the Albed language is a cipher, much less than a language. Different words don't have different meanings. Everything has the exact same meaning, the exact same amount of letters. It is just switched to a different letter that somehow they all made make sense. So there's no like words without vowels or anything like that. I think all the vowels are replaced with other vowels. Even Y, I'm pretty sure. I think Y equals like A or something like that. But in any case, I think it is very interesting and I like talking about it. One of the other things I like talking about is summaries and summarizing. And what I want to summarize from this video is that I believe Final Fantasy X is the greatest game of all time. Maybe I didn't explain it perfectly. Maybe I went off on a couple tangents, but that's just how I go. That is just how I am. And I think Final Fantasy X really stands the test of time. It has aged wonderfully. It's been remastered. Maybe the faces could use a little work, and maybe I don't really like the remastered font either, but there is a lot to come for Final Fantasy X. One day it will see a remake. Maybe that day will be in the next couple years. Maybe it won't be on the scale of Final Fantasy VII remake, but there'll be a remake nonetheless. Or maybe even some kind of like remastering again. Maybe something to update it on the PS4 version to bring it to the PS5. There could be any number of things added to this game. There could be patches to bring in like some fixed up content. You know, you never know. There could be optional updates. There could be a lot more developed in the modding community. I know the cutscene remover is fairly popular. It's got its own speedrunning boards now. And I think Final Fantasy X really just speaks to me. It just reminds me why I love gaming, and it makes me love and appreciate games just that much more, even if I'm going to compare them inevitably to Final Fantasy X, the greatest game of all time. This is Montaven Orville, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.